Okay, so this is our first lecture that you're going to hopefully get all the information you need online rather than in class. And this one comes from the very beginning of your book. It's just some basic definitions. Since our class is biology, and biology, if you look it up, is the study of life, we need to start off with a basic definition, a working definition scientifically of what constitutes life. What characteristics do we use to say that something is alive? So these have been broken down, and we're going to break it into 5 basic characteristics that living things have. And in order to be a living thing, we would say that it has to have all 5 of these characteristics. So the first characteristic is that living things are organized, meaning they're more than the sum of their parts. Living things are made of extremely simple things. In fact, the 3 main elements in living things you should know are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And it's easy to remember it as CHO. That's 97% of a living thing is composed of just those 3 things, and they're very common, simple things everybody's heard of. You can find them everywhere, but yet we're put together in such a way, such a complicated way, that we're more than just the sum of our parts. In a lab, nobody's ever been able to create a living thing from scratch, even given all of these elements. The most they've done, I think, very recently was to create some working DNA that could be put into an empty cell, but the cell, again, already existed, so they still weren't really building from scratch. Which brings us to the smallest living thing, which is a cell. Okay, and here you see all of the levels. We start with chemicals, um, elements, compounds, which go into organelles, which are tiny cell parts that do different jobs, and that brings us to the cell. What we believe about cells is basically put together into something called cell theory that we'll talk about later, but it basically says that all living things are made of cells, and that cells form the structures and perform all the functions to keep a living thing alive. So a cell in itself could be a living thing on its own, in, for example, bacteria, certain protists. But then in more complicated things, what we see are the cells are then organized into more complicated levels. A group of cells working together make a tissue, such as muscle tissue, and then different tissues are put together to make an organ. For example, the heart would contain connective tissue, muscle tissue, etc. An organ system would then be your circulatory system, which would be the heart and the vessels and the blood. And then several of these systems put together would make a full working organism. The other levels above that are really levels that we talk about when we get to ecology and environmental science, about how organisms then can be groups of organisms form populations, and then all of those populations form a community, and the community plus all the non-living things around it make the ecosystem, and then all the living space on the entire Earth is the biosphere. And so we'll come back to that later. Okay, and so our second characteristic of living things is that living things metabolize. And what that basically means is they use energy. Metabolism, people think of metabolism as how quickly you burn calories, for example, and that is a part of metabolism, but the idea is that it has to do with energy coming in and then leaving. All living things require energy. It's used for growth, repair, reproduction, all those things that living things have to do. So the energy comes in, it originates from the sun. The producers or autotrophs, self-feeders, they basically can capture the sun's energy, convert it to chemical energy, which they can then use themselves or pass along to the consumers, who then have to eat producers or eat other consumers in order to gain their energy. Eventually we have decomposers, which tend to break down matter and release whatever energy was still trapped in it. The second part of metabolism has to do with what we would call homeostasis, which is basically saying that internal conditions have to be maintained within a narrow range. For example, if we were to get too hot or too cold, we would die. And if our blood sugar gets too high or low, or the levels of potassium get too high or too low, or any of those things, there's just hundreds of different things that have to be maintained within a very narrow range in order for us to stay alive. And so we maintain what's called homeostasis. We often achieve this by something called negative feedback, meaning that, for example, if we're producing, let's say, insulin, which tends to lower our blood sugar, If our blood sugar gets too low, what will happen is there'll be a trigger that basically sends a message back, feedback, saying, okay, shut that down, stop producing that, because we are, getting to a level where we don't want to be. And so that's called negative feedback. The idea that at the very end of an assembly line, you can have a worker calling back, okay, shut the assembly line down for now because we have too much of this. And then as the level goes back down, it turns back on. Energy cycling through an ecosystem. This is a nice little diagram of it. Again, we already talked about this energy coming from the sun. Producers convert it to sugar. Consumers then get it by eating the producers, and then decomposers then turn around and recycle it. It's really important to see that they do not recycle the energy. What they do recycle is matter that may still contain some energy, and there is a difference because energy eventually gets to a point where it's no longer useful. You may remember learning the thermodynamics laws, energy can't be created or destroyed, which is true, but if you notice here, energy output, what eventually can happen is energy basically becomes its simplest form, which is basically random motion or metabolic heat. And so if we didn't have the sun constantly inputting new energy, or bringing in energy that's useful, eventually we would just run out. Not because energy was destroyed, but because it had all been converted to a form that wasn't useful to us anymore. And so that's something that's very important, to know the difference, that it's not destroyed, but we do constantly need an input of energy because we can recycle matter, but energy itself doesn't necessarily get recycled. The third thing is that living things respond. Really simple. We respond to changes in our environment. For example, little clip right here, showing plants responding to light. Here you have, it's called phototropism, and the idea is that certain hormones in the plants, believe it or not, they actually have hormones as well. The hormones will actually cause them to bend towards a light source. And this is just one simple example of living things responding to a stimulus. Living things reproduce, again, a very obvious one. What they mean by this is that when we reproduce as a species, meaning we pass our DNA along so that our species then continues generation after generation. So that's what they mean by living things reproduce. And of course we grow and develop, which you can see here, just an example of a living thing growing and developing. The fifth one is that living things evolve or adapt. And the idea is that over time, we can see a change in a species. Individuals don't evolve. It's a big mistake that people make. What an individual can do, an individual could have a mutation, a change in its DNA. And that particular individual then would be a new variety. And we already have lots and lots of variety. If you just look at people, we see, skin tones, heights, blood types, and all kinds of internal things that we don't even see. There's all kinds of variety. And the idea is that certain characteristics may be more favorable than others. And if that's the case, then what will happen is organisms that are carrying those better characteristics will tend to live longer and pass them on. So over time, what we can see is an entire population changes. In this diagram here, this is showing pigeons. These pigeons all come from, they're basically all subspecies. They all come from the same species of pigeon. But in this case, what's happened over time is through mutations here and there over many years, and then artificial selection, meaning people specifically choosing traits that they liked and breeding only those pigeons, we've basically created all of these different variations or varieties of pigeons. And this is a really good example of variation and in general of evolution in the sense of just changes over time. In nature, most of these pigeons would probably not survive very well. We've created them because they have certain characteristics that we like. We've done the similar thing with dogs. We've created these breeds of dogs, choosing certain characteristics that we liked. Oh, we want our dog to be a good hunter. These are good hunting dogs. These are good hunting characteristics. And then we can breed our dogs to make the best hunters that there are. And so this is a good example of evolution. This last section here just summarizes what we've already discussed here about just basic definitions, cells being the basic units of life, tissues being groups of cells that are working together. Interestingly, cells in a single-celled organism have the ability to do every single thing to stay alive on their own. But if you think of a cell in a multicellular organism, they've lost that ability. As a multicellular organism, what's happened is there's a division of labor. And so certain cells only do a specific job. Those cells on their own would not be able to survive. A muscle cell contracts, and that's really all it can do. It has to depend on other cells around it to provide it with other things that it needs, but it then allows the organism to be much more complex. And so tissues then form organs. We end up with organ systems, and then an organism, which is composed of all of these cells organized into these higher levels. Above the single organism level, we'll get to this much, much later in the year. Population, which is a group of organisms. Community, several populations. An ecosystem, which is several populations, but then adding in non-living things in the area. And then the biosphere, which is the entire area of the earth where living things exist. So, for example, you could have a population of fish. The community would include those fish, but plus the other species of fish, the plants, the algae, the bacteria, all of that stuff. The ecosystem of the pond would include all of that, but then adding in the water, the minerals, the temperatures, all of those factors. And then, like I said, the biosphere is the entire earth. Okay, so taxonomy is another word for classification. And this is just sort of going along with how we organize living things in order to study them, how we classify them. Linnaeus is considered the father of classification. You don't have to know his name. Used to be that kingdom was the main level, but today, because there's so many kingdoms that we've discovered, we now use domain as our main level of classification. And this just shows here the three domains. Eukarya, which is the domain that we belong to, and all the eukaryotic organisms with a nucleus belong to. Archaea, which has only one kingdom, Archaebacteria, and then bacteria, which has only one kingdom, Eubacteria. And even though Archaebacteria means ancient bacteria, we show that as far as our DNA and things are concerned, that the Archaebacteria is actually more closely related to eukaryotes than the Eubacteria. All right, levels of classification. This just shows you a sample. If we look at the leopard, the human, and the parrot, and we talk about these levels of classification, you'll see that they're all in the same domain. They're all eukaryotes. They're all animals, and they're in the same kingdom. And they're all chordates, meaning they all have backbones. However, once we get down to the class, we see that parrots are in the class Aves or Aves, and we see the leopard and the human are both mammals, and therefore, based on this, we would say that leopards and humans are more closely related to each other than either one of them would be to the parrot. From there, we now see here where leopards and humans digress. The leopard is a carnivora order, the meat eaters with the long canines, and humans are primates similar to monkeys and apes. And then the parrots already had diverged. From there, families are different, and then genus and species. It's important our scientific name, the way we name organisms, has to do with the genus and the species. And we see this here. The way we name organisms is called binomial nomenclature, meaning a two-name system of naming things. The genus is first and the species is second. They typically come from Latin. The genus is capitalized, and then it's either written in italics or when we write it, we underline it. You can also shorten the genus to an initial after you write it out the first time. So here's an example. Our genus is Homo, species sapiens. We write it out Homo sapiens. Notice the H capitalized, but not the S. And then after it was written the first time, it could be written like that. If you were doing it on paper, you would want to underline it. So there's 6 kingdoms today, and again, this is something that's probably going to change. They're going to probably break Protista up. I think they're already working on that. Everything can be divided into prokaryotes and eukaryotes, but 2 of the kingdoms include prokaryotic organisms, and that's the Archaebacteria and the Eubacteria. And we'll talk about the differences between them later, but they are the 2 kingdoms that include organisms without a nucleus. Eukaryotes are organisms with a nucleus, protista, which are single-celled like algae, amoeba, paramecium, those pond organisms. Fungi, multicellular, cell walls made of chitin, it's pronounced chitin, and they're all heterotrophic. Plants, multicellular, but they're autotrophic, they can make their own food, and they always have cell walls made out of cellulose. Animals, of course, don't have a cell wall. So these are our characteristics. And there's just some pictures of life's diversity. And that's it.